we face a crisis in housing. And this crisis, in the context of the current pandemic, as people lose jobs and income, are put at even greater risk of eviction in the coming months. And in the context of the broader political economy. So I want to start by talking about the crisis upon us, because although viruses and genetic mutations are natural and inevitable in the world, our political responses and our social organization is not. And so want to think about what that looks like. So housing insecurity in this moment, more than 40 million people have filed jobless claims. We know that only about half of these folks are receiving unemployment payments. We know that the vast majority are lower income. Almost twice the percentage of lower income folks have lost jobs or been furloughed than people who have incomes that are higher. We know that the vast majority are working class folks. We know that disproportionately folks are Black and brown. And this is only the beginning. So this graph here shows the number of new unemployment claims. And although the numbers are coming down, that doesn't mean that the people who have filed claims earlier have come off of the rolls, or have found jobs or are back at work and back earning, right? So this is a really serious problem that has been precipitated by the COVID crisis. So the system's response has so far blunted some of the most vicious potential symptoms. Government assistance through expanded and enhanced unemployment benefits and the $1,200 stimulus, as well as personal savings and supports that some people may have had or may have been able to turn to. As well, in the case of housing, probably most substantially, is a federal halt on evictions. But this ends July 28th, and this is just a demonstration that all of these responses have been inadequate in size and in scope. The $1,200 stimulus is not enough money even to pay fair market rent in Baltimore City, much less in places like San Francisco or in New York City. The federal halt on evictions may be extended in some states and some localities, but at this point, there are many places that after the end of next month, there may be nothing standing between people and the streets. When we look at the problem of housing deprivation, that is people who are deprived of housing, what we typically call homelessness, the last best numbers that we have, and best is I want to qualify here, but the last best number we have is from July of 2019. This is when localities all around the United States, mandated by the federal government, last counted the people that were without housing in their jurisdictions. And in January of last year, 567,000 people were counted as homeless. Disproportionately, these folks were Black and brown. Disproportionately, not just to the US population, but also disproportionately to the population that's in poverty. We can talk more about why that might be, why that is. The rates among families and children continue to rise. And we know that this is a substantial undercount. The data collection practices, the definitions that are used are very, very narrow and are quite doubtable. And so this problem that was before the COVID crisis is actually a wild undercount of the significance of what we face in terms of homelessness or housing deprivation. And we'll talk more about that later. Now, the system's response to homelessness or to housing deprivation has come in two large forms. So one is expanding shelters. So there have been localities that have found additional space in community centers or in schools that are not being used presently. The city of Las Vegas they found parking lots in which they put folks. It's worth noting that Las Vegas has about 150,000 hotel rooms, and in the present crisis, though many of those rooms sit empty, at the same time that a parking lot was the best that the city could find for its housing deprived neighbors. There have been some cities that have found hotels. Mostly this is for a relatively small group of people who are especially vulnerable to COVID. It's worth noting that these responses by the system haven't come generally out of the goodwill of our political leaders. And I don't want to suggest that none of our political leaders have goodwill, but they've mostly come as a result of advocacy and collective action. In Baltimore City, for example, people were organizing to disrupt press conferences of the mayor demanding that he respond to the people who had no place to stay and who were, like sardines, stuck head to toe in some of the shelters. Now, we've talked in the last slides about what's been in our face and what may have been in the news. But what's existed before, what's beyond, and what underlies the present moment is very, very important for us to consider. We want to think about this, or I think about this kind of like an iceberg. What we're seeing is just what's above the surface, and what's underneath is critically important to understand if we're going to be able to address the underlying problems and not just the symptoms of the moment. So before and beyond the COVID crisis, there are two features of our housing system that I think are absolutely important to understand and to acknowledge if we are to address them. First is, over the past decades, we have seen increasingly unaffordable housing created through policy and practice. The fact of the matter is, there's not a whole lot of money to be made in providing housing to poor and working class people. And housing, fundamentally, in our society, is a place where wealth is sheltered. It's not about finding places to shelter people. It benefits developers. It benefits the big banks. One example of this is through developers buying and holding properties until the costs of those properties rise, right? They're speculating on increased value. And this is the case all around the country. Most recently, we might be aware of 4 moms in Oakland who took possession of an abandoned house that was owned by Westwood, a company that was speculating on that and maintaining a vacant house so that it could make more money. Bankers also have made lots of money through the housing system by creating all sorts of things in a sort of shell game in which they make money regardless of whether we have housing or not. Second, systemic racism has been a prevalent feature, a ubiquitous feature in policy and practice when it comes to housing. And we've seen example after example after example of this, from racial zoning and racial covenants to redlining, when the federal government colluded with banks to systematically deny Black and brown families and individuals access to the backing for their home mortgages, to segregated public housing, to suburban development, to on and on and on. We continue to see this. And so these two features underlie the housing crisis that we see. And some of the impacts are quite significant. So in 2019, again, before COVID hit, the US had a shortage of 7 million units available to working class people, 71% of whom pay more than 50% of their income towards housing. When households are paying more than even 30%, a small economic crisis or emergency can push them over the edge into homelessness. It's the case today in the United States that nowhere, there is no single place in the United States that a full-time worker earning minimum wage can afford housing at the area's fair market rent. And so almost half of all of the renters in the United States spend more than 30% of their income on housing. That's unsustainable. And this wasn't just created. This has been created over time. Just between 2011 and 2017, 4 million units of housing available to low-income folks were lost and weren't replaced, which leads to more and more people losing housing every year. In Baltimore City, we have 150,000 evictions filed every year in the city. Some of the impacts in the context of racialized oppression: we see disparities in wealth, we see disparities in health and well-being. White households have a median income that is 10 times that of Black and brown households. Why does this connect to housing? Well, for most working people, the largest single asset they have is their home. And because of the policies and practices that have systematically denied Black and brown households access to owning housing, they have had less access, substantially less access. They've been denied the ability to accumulate wealth in the way that many working white people have. Over 50% of African American and Latino renters spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And we see hyper-segregated cities, for example, in Baltimore, where there are neighborhoods that are less than a 5K run, so less than 3 miles apart, where you go from a neighborhood that is 98% white, a neighborhood that is 98% Black. And running that 3 miles, you would have a drop in median income from about $135,000 to about $11,000 a year. In that 3-mile run, you would lose 20 years of life expectancy. That's in one city. Beyond housing insecurity, we see housing deprivation. And I mentioned before the number of people who were counted in January of 2019. In Baltimore, and I keep talking about Baltimore because I know something about that city. In Baltimore, in the January 2019 count, 2,300 people were counted as homeless. Now that sounds like a good number of people, but when we consider the scope of the problem beyond the official count, when we consider what's really behind it, the numbers are staggering. 25,000 people are served every year by the city's homeless service provider community. 1/3 of Baltimore's households that are low income can't pay their rent. As I mentioned before, 150,000 cases are filed in rent court annually. And this is because homelessness is fundamentally poverty without a key. So people struggling to make ends meet, like 1/4 of Baltimoreans who are officially poor. And as folks who know about the federal poverty line is not an accurate description of what you need to survive. The federal poverty line for a family of 3 is about 21,000. In Baltimore, a majority of people who are poor live below half of the federal poverty line. And if we were to take a more accurate measure of what people need to survive and say double the federal poverty line, almost half of the people in the city live below that. So, and this is important to understand because when we understand the extent of the problem, it pushes us to understand what needs to be done in order to solve it. If the problem is 2,300 people, we might be able to address that with some programs. If the problem is 1/4 of the city or 1/2 of the city that are struggling, we need to think about radical, revolutionary change. So I want to move for a few minutes and talk about the crisis and what it isn't. Because oftentimes when we talk about problems, we consider what the problems might be, and depending on how we define the problem, we will determine certain solutions based on that. So, um, so consider in this case, just as an example, the murder of Black and brown folk by the police, right? There are different ways that this problem has been defined over the years, right? Some people have said the problem is really just a few bad apples. And if that's the problem, then we need to get those folks out of the police force, right? Right? We need to prosecute them. And we need to make sure that people have training and techniques that are going to be effective. That seems like a reasonable solution if the problem is really a few bad apples. Right? Some people have said that the problem is lack of representation, that the police don't represent the communities that they police. If that's the case, then a reasonable solution is to diversify the police force. A reasonable solution is to implement local hiring requirements. If the problem, however, is that the police do not and have not ever served the interests of working people, if they've never served the interests of Black people or Indigenous people or newly arriving people to the United States, if the police instead have taken on the functions and are born out of slave patrols and union busting and colonial capture and terror, if that's the nature of policing, then we need to radically reconsider what policing ought to be, right? So the way that we define the problem, how we conceptualize it, leads us to certain solutions. And so it's really important for us to understand what is and also what is not behind the problem. So, getting back to housing. The problem isn't a lack of resources. Even if we just look at the housing subsidies that the government provides today, we have right now a disproportionate, wildly disproportionate amount of money going to affluent households. We spend far more on the mortgage interest tax deduction than we do on all of the public housing programs in the federal government. The problem isn't a lack of resources that are potentially available to fund. So take the CARES Act. This was the federal response to the COVID crisis. It included, among other things, $12 billion in additional emergency funding for homeless services and for enhanced subsidies in public housing and in vouchers, recognizing that there would be people who were in public housing or who had vouchers who were going to lose their jobs, and we would need additional money to backfill their rent. Federal government provided $12 billion to care for all of the people, all of the additional needs for those who were homeless or poor and housing insecure. Compare that to the increase in wealth since March 18th of the billionaires in the United States. If we had just taken the money that the billionaires have made since March 18th, we would have 50 times as much than all of the money that we have put in to address the current crisis for folks who are homeless or housing insecure and poor, right? The problem isn't a lack of funding. The problem is how the funding is distributed, right? The problem is who has control, who has power. Again, thinking about what the problem isn't. The problem isn't a lack of housing. We have about 17 million housing units in the United States that are currently vacant. I looked at Baltimore City's website yesterday, and there are 17,000 vacant buildings in Baltimore City, according to the city. So we know that's an undercount, right? 17 million. And I show you this graph, which is taken from the Census Bureau this quarter, just to show that there are vacancies all around the United States. It's not just in the South or the Midwest. In the Northeast and in the West, there are fewer vacant rental buildings, but there are vacants. And this chart only shows rentals. It doesn't show all of the vacant houses that are actually owned and may not be occupied because somebody has a vacation home in Florida or a place on the beach or a place in the mountains, right? So the problem isn't that we don't have enough housing. The problem isn't scarcity. The problem is distribution, and distribution is rooted in power. The problem fundamentally is the system, right? The problem is that we have a housing system that is part of a broader system of control, a system that allows for some to amass and shelter their wealth, that allows for entrenched oppression, including and especially of Black and brown folk and working folk. And part of that system is housing deprivation. So we've seen in recent years people move from the dehumanizing language of the homeless to more person-centered language of people experiencing homelessness. And this is an important step, not only because it's humanizing, because it also rightly recognizes that homelessness isn't an immutable characteristic of any person. Rather, it's something that people are forced to struggle through and struggle against. However, homelessness isn't fundamentally an individual experience. It is rather one of many forms of systemic deprivation, which are both consequences and servants of capitalism. Now, how is it a consequence? Well, when we take human needs and turn them into things that are bought and sold, and then we say to those people whose wages are too low or whose labor is considered unnecessary by the capitalists, they can't afford it, right? And they are deprived of it. It is also, and importantly, a tool to control. As one of my comrades used to tell me, when he would hear folks talk about how nobody wanted homelessness, right? You've heard people say this. You've heard politicians say this. You've heard business people say this. You've heard even people who work at nonprofit organizations, right? Nobody wants homelessness. But if nobody wanted homelessness, it wouldn't exist, right? It's not like something that is natural. It's not inevitable. We've got the housing, we have the resources. So what's the function of it, right? As this friend and comrade of mine says, when I'm standing there on the corner begging for help, the people who are riding the bus to get to their lousy jobs, working in unsafe conditions for wages that are way too low, for a boss who treats them like crap, they see two things. First, they see a cautionary tale. They see that you could be here. If you get out of line, you could be on this street corner. And they also know that I'm here and I could take your job, right? So one of the functions of homelessness and all forms of systemic deprivation is to be this cautionary tale. It also, importantly, is a way to stigmatize and separate folks, right? Now, you might say, it's kind of off the wall to suggest that homelessness serves intentional purpose, but two things, right? One, homelessness costs a lot of money. In Baltimore, we spend about $30 per person per night to keep people homeless in a shelter. That's $900 per person per month. For a family of three, that's $2,700. In Baltimore, you could rent a pretty nice place for $2,700, right? So we're spending a lot of money to maintain this system of deprivation. Why would we do that? What's the purpose of it? It has to serve some ends. It has to serve some purpose. It has to serve some interests. Well, think about this. If we were to make housing a guarantee, if we were to separate housing stability from work and wages, do you think workers would take quite so much shit from their bosses? I expect that they wouldn't. I expect that workers wouldn't put up with quite as much as they do. So this is part of a system of control. Now, in this moment, what do we do? So we have a crisis. We have had a crisis. And what this crisis in this moment allows is for some possibilities. It provides for mobilization, it provides for action. Movements can make the impossible possible. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we might be thinking about as we think about what this organizing and mobilizing looks like. So first, I think that we need to push for reforms that challenge the system in fundamental ways. We need reforms that are rooted in an analysis of power, an analysis of history, an analysis of how systems work and for whose interests they work. And then we need to say, when we're pushing for things, does this prioritize human needs rather than profits in larger and larger parts of the economy? For the past 40 years, at least, there has been a push to privatize more and more of the economy, to make into things that can be bought and sold basic needs: housing, healthcare, education, roads, right? All of these things are being privatized more and more. We need to push back against that. We need to think about how we can create more democratic control in more areas of life. Thinking about how we have the power to make decisions, right? We need to think about how we can build power and solidarity, how we can build cooperation and care, how we can foster sustainability and build class consciousness. All of these, I think, are important questions to ask ourselves as we are working to address the present crisis. Because if we don't think intentionally, we're likely to recreate the system with a new facade, right? We'll get some reforms, but those reforms won't fix any of the underlying problems. And we need to consider, I think, an array of actions. So around the country, we see acts of protest, and this is important. This is critically important. It's not the only type of action, right? We can think about what we can withhold from the current system, right? Around the country, people are starting to organize renters to withhold their rent, right? Because if one renter chooses to withhold their rent, that's that person's problem. But if a whole building chooses to withhold their rent, if tens of millions of Americans who can't pay their rent refuse to pay, that's the problem of the system, right? We need to think about ways that we can intervene, like the Oakland moms, or like the reclaimers in LA, people who are taking property, right? People who are seizing things, liberating goods, right? And we need to consider, I think, what points of power, where do we have leverage? So oftentimes we think, again, about where decisions are made, right? We think about the decisions made in the boardrooms or the decision made that are made in the halls of City Hall or Congress. But we should also think about where things are produced, where things, including where housing stability is destroyed, right? When people are evicted, we need to think about where we're consuming. In the case of housing, that's our rent and mortgage payments. And we also need to think about the points of assumption. And this is important because this helps to challenge the narratives. This challenges the dominant narratives. So, I think about the folks in Oakland, or the folks in LA, the reclaimers, who have taken over 11 vacant homes that had been purchased by the state. So these were publicly owned buildings, right? And when they occupied them, they said, this is public land. This is a taxpayer house. I paid for it. You paid for it. We all paid for it. All of these vacant housing on public land should be for public good, to create real affordable housing, right? We need to challenge these narratives. We need to challenge the narratives about there's not enough housing. We need to challenge the narratives around there's not enough resources, right? And we need to think about all of the various forms of power that we have: social, political, economic. The crisis provides a moment in which the invisible can be made visible. And as we're seeing, a moment through organizing and mobilizing can be turned into a movement which makes the seemingly impossible possible. We've seen and can learn both from historical and from recent efforts, which could be magnified. And in thinking about history, I think about an observation that was made about 150 years ago. Observation was that there are certainly enough buildings, there are certainly enough dwellings to address any housing shortage if we were to rationally use them. This can happen only if we prioritize people's needs over claims that allow people to make profits. This isn't a new observation, these aren't new ideas, but what may be new in this moment, at least in my lifetime, is that the crises are shaking people in ways that I'm not sure that they have before. And if we organize and mobilize in a way that builds solidarity for democratic control, in a way that prioritizes human needs over profits, we can build something new in the rubble of the old. And only by the solution to these broader questions are we going to be able to address the problems of the housing crisis before us.